Now that we've learned about the military and political affairs of the early Byzantine Empire, let's see how it was organized. The provincial system established by Constantine in the 4th century CE lasted until the mid-7th century, when it was replaced by a set of districts called themes. This was a response to the empire's military problems, since the themes were administered by generals who enjoyed the kind of authority which had belonged to civilian officials since the time of Diocletian in the 3rd century. The territory of each cleme was divided into plots of land that were given to soldiers in lieu of payments which the government was no longer able to make. Moreover, the land these soldiers received settled them on two fronts, the region being invaded by the Slavs and what was fast becoming the Muslim world. Since their families were expected to continue to supply men to the army, the themes were a long-term defensive measure. Though the empire was becoming smaller, poorer, and more threatened from the 7th through the 9th centuries, these changes did not weaken the central authority in the way that similar changes did in the West, as the local landowning aristocracy became more and more independent, and their estates turned into self-sustaining communities. The aristocrats of the East continued to be dependent on the support and goodwill of the court in Constantinople, while farmers had more choice than European serfs did about where and for whom they worked. But this situation began to change during the 9th century as wealthy landowners became more independent of the government and developed a relationship with their workers which was more like European feudalism. The Byzantine Empire was organized around cities founded centuries before, during the Hellenistic era, but at the heart of its economy was the new city of Constantinople, which soon became the largest in the East and then in all of Europe, with a population of around 500,000 in the 5th century. A number of other towns grew up along the roads that supplied the city with its needs, and new farmlands had to be cultivated to supply its food, including the thousands of free rations that were distributed every day to its inhabitants. Constantinople had trade relations with Egypt to the south and North Africa to the west, and it became the endpoint of the Silk Road, which connected it with Central and East Asia. Its economic importance increased even more during the 6th century, when Byzantine merchants established new trade routes through East Africa and the Black Sea that bypassed the routes dominated by their Persian competitors. And by smuggling silkworms out of China, they were able to produce their own silk, which was the most lucrative commodity of the time. Constantine created a new gold coin, the solidus, which, as its name implies, was made of pure precious metal, and therefore much more trustworthy than the traditional denarius, whose silver content had been gradually reduced by the government because it needed to mint more coins to pay its soldiers. The sources of gold used to mint the solidus are unclear, though some of it may have come from the treasuries of pagan temples, which were increasingly being looted and closed by Constantine and his successors. Once gold currency became available throughout the empire, it became the medium of a tax established by Constantine, which was levied on most merchants and craftspeople. This tax was considered a heavy burden by the people who had to pay it, and its abolition late in the 5th century may have stimulated an increase in trade. The empire's economic dominance was set back by the Arab conquests of the 7th century, which took away its control of Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. But it flourished until the 13th century, when the Mediterranean sea trade finally came under the control of Italian merchant cities, and Constantinople itself was occupied by crusaders from the west for about 50 years. The political and military affairs of the Byzantine Empire were closely tied to its religious life, which was very diverse and chaotic because the cities where the church first developed, and which were now a part of the Byzantine world, had produced many competing theological doctrines. One of the most bitter of these conflicts was between the Orthodox doctrine that the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, were similar in their substance, and the claim that their substances were identical, which was promoted by the Arian Church, to which many of the Germanic tribes belonged. But there was also a dispute within the Orthodox Church as to whether the nature of Jesus during his earthly lifetime was both divine and human, or was entirely divine. The first position, which was shared by the Catholic Church in Rome, was confirmed by the Orthodox leadership at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, though there were also efforts to formulate a compromise that would satisfy Rome without alienating the adherents of the Monophysite or single nature doctrine, who were predominant in the Byzantine provinces of Egypt and Syria. While the kings and popes of Western Europe often clashed over which of them was the superior authority, there was much more cooperation and interaction between Byzantine emperors and the patriarchs who headed the Orthodox Church. Emperors often called for and were in charge of the religious councils that determined Orthodox doctrine and condemned the groups they considered heretical. Starting with Constantine, they funded the construction of churches while attacking pagan temples. They also passed laws that persecuted pagans, Jews, and Christians who were considered heretical. Starting in the 7th century, the ceremony in which new emperors were crowned went from being a secular military procedure to an explicitly religious one, which took place in a church, where the patriarch placed a crown on the ruler's head. The most common venue for these ceremonies was the Hagia Sophia itself. The most controversial and divisive religious debate of the earlier Byzantine Empire was over iconoclasm, or breaking icons, the belief that it was forbidden to revere images of Christ, Mary, and the saints. This practice had become popular among Byzantines during the difficult times of the 7th century, but it was opposed during the 8th and 9th centuries by those who believed that the use of icons was a violation of the biblical second commandment, and that art was unable to depict simultaneously both the divine and human aspects of Jesus in which Orthodox doctrine believed. The iconoclasts also blamed the empire's problems, including recent military losses to the Muslims, on the popularity of this practice. They included both religious and secular leaders. The Emperor Leo III may have been the first to prohibit the veneration of icons, though we have more evidence that his son, Constantine V, did so, as he also summoned a church council to condemn it. These actions widened the rift between the Orthodox Church and the Roman Pope, who supported the use of sacred images, and there were bishops on both sides of the conflict. There were also proponents of icons among the empire's monks, and Constantine closed many of the monasteries that venerated them. Though his immediate successors moved away from iconoclasm, it was brought back in the 9th century by the new dynasty of Leo V, who may have been reacting to the fact that he was suffering losses in the conflict with the Bulgars, while his predecessor Constantine, who was an iconoclast, had managed to defeat them. The military, social, and financial difficulties of this period would be largely reversed during the 10th and 11th centuries, when many of the territories held by the early empire were regained. Cities once again became centers of culture and economic growth, education and classical literature were revived, and there were new developments in art and architecture. As we'll see in the next tutorial, this period, which is known as the Macedonian Renaissance, was the last time that the empire would experience such growth and success before it was finally overwhelmed by the Muslim world in the 15th century.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.